Well, we are both pleased and fortunate to have two talented and knowledgeable speakers today, Howard Libet and Emily Goodman, to speak on anti-Semitism, a topic that never seems to go away. We're going to ask that you put your questions in the chat room, and I'm going to do a brief bio on both of our speakers. So Howard Libet has been the executive director of the Baltimore Jewish Council since 2016. Prior to this position, Mr. Libet served as Chief of Public Affairs and Director of Strategic Planning and Policy in the Baltimore City Mayor's Office, overseeing communication efforts for Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake and agencies of the city government. For almost 6 years, Mr. Libet was Chief Operating Officer at Kearney O'Doherty Public Affairs. He also spent 15 years as a reporter and editor for the Baltimore Sun, starting as a suburban education reporter and writing about such other topics as state government, politics, and environmental issues. Howard is a graduate of Stanford University and lives with his lovely wife and 2 children in Rogers Forge. The Libet family are active members of the Baltimore Hebrew congregation. Emily Goodman is the Director of Holocaust and Anti-Semitism Programming at BJC, where she is responsible for Holocaust commemoration programming, the Survivors Speakers Bureau, as well as the implementation of programming to help counter anti-Semitism within the Baltimore community. Prior to assuming this position, Ms. Goodman was employed with the BJC as a program coordinator, working primarily with the Elijah Cummings Youth Program in Israel. Before joining the Baltimore Jewish Council, Emily served as a research assistant, conducting research on cognitive impairment and memory decline at the Johns Hopkins Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Ms. Goodman holds a Bachelor of Science degree in gerontology with concentrations on family and human services and health science from Towson University. Welcome to both of our wonderful speakers.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Thank you for the very generous introductions. And I wish, like all of you, I wish we could be in person. But we continue 2 years into the pandemic to figure out how to do this and make do on Zoom. And hopefully our presentation today will work for all of you. Feel free to put questions into the chat, as Cece said, but also afterward, if we'll have time at the end if people want to jump in with some questions as well. Emily and I are happy to respond, talk about issues, things we may have missed. We have a PowerPoint we're gonna share to kind of walk through some of the things. And again, if I'll keep an eye on the chat too. If you have a question related to something we're talking about at that moment, we're happy to, I'll try and keep an eye on it while Emily's running the PowerPoint to make sure we can respond in real time as best we can. But thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I know all of you are as horrified as we are by the surge in anti-Semitism we're seeing across the country, which we'll kind of walk through a bit, as well as just this past weekend's events. For those of you who are able, I urge you to think about attending services this weekend, either in person if you're comfortable and your synagogue allows, or virtually, as a show that we're not going to be intimidated by actions. I thought that was really powerful the week after what happened in Pittsburgh and the week after what happened in Poway. And I think this is another opportunity for all of us to say, let's make sure to show our that our faith will not be intimidated. Emily, you want to start the PowerPoint? And I think you're kicking things off.
Yes. All right. Bear with me for one moment while I get this maximized. And okay, can everyone see that? All right. Well, just to echo Howard's statements, thank you for inviting us to be here to speak to you all today. as he said, very important subject. Obviously, it's not going away. And if anything, this past weekend, we can see the need to learn about it more and how to combat it. So to start, I just want to go over the definition of anti-Semitism. So the most commonly adapted version of anti-Semitism comes from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And the definition is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and/or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Now, this definition actually goes on to be a 500-word document, and it is adopted by 32 different countries around the world. And the reason why this is so commonly used is because it is so expansive that for countries that have a harder time recognizing anti-Semitism, the definition is so broad that they're able to find the bits and pieces that they can identify in their own countries within that definition. So then I want to talk a little bit about the brief history of anti-Semitism. Obviously, it is a very complex and long history. So I'm just going to do a couple key historic pieces of anti-Semitism. So it dates all the way back to biblical times. It goes back to the story of Hanukkah, Jews resisting adoption of local ruler of religions, all the way to the crucifixion of Jesus, which today Jews are still being blamed for as well. That is a very brought up part of anti-Semitism. And then it goes into the Middle Ages, where Jews were blamed for the bubonic plague, which killed an estimated 1/3 of the population, but Jews were accused of poisoning wells to spread the disease. And then it also talks about blood libel, which is the myth that Jews used blood of non-Jews, particularly Christian children, for ritual purposes. And then, of course, the Crusades, in which everyone who was non-Christian was targeted to either convert or be executed, basically. Then you bring in a little bit more up into modern times. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a fake document forged by Tsarist secret police. And this document claimed that Jewish leaders from across nations were plotting to dominate and enslave mankind and destroy Christianity. And so this false document propagated some of the more commonly known stereotypes seen today. And from Europe, it was then brought over to the United States. Henry Ford and his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, translated the protocols and then published it in the newspaper.
Did Amy answer you?
And then from there, those documents were published into a book that was translated into multiple languages. And Hitler was actually known to quote from that book very often. After that, we get to the Holocaust, where many people believe that anti-Semitism began with the Holocaust. For Jews, we know that is not the case. And the definition of the Holocaust is the systematic state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its allies and collaborators. And then from there, anti-Semitism did not end with the end of the Holocaust and the end of World War II. There is contemporary anti-Semitism, obviously from there through today and ongoing. And so some of the examples of contemporary anti-Semitism include targeting the state of Israel as a Jewish collective. And that does not mean criticizing Israel's governmental policies. So they are different. Calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of radical ideology or extremism, making dehumanizing allegations about Jews as a collective, accusing Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel than their interested than their own nation. Than their interests than their own nation, and then denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination. So if we want to look at some more statistics, Back in October of 2021, the American Jewish Committee released their State of Anti-Semitism in America survey that they do annually. This is based on interviews of a representative sample of 1,433 Jews 18 and older. So I just want to show a little bit of the information gathered from that survey. 1 in 4 American Jews has been a target in anti-Semitism. This was in the year 2020 to 2021 through in-person remarks, online or on social media, by way of physical attacks over the 12 months leading up to that survey. 4 in 10 American Jews have changed their behavior due to fears of anti-Semitism over the past year, with 22% saying they've avoided wearing or displaying things that would enable others to identify them as Jewish. So whether that's wearing a kippot or taking your mezuzah down or having your menorah in your window during Hanukkah, 4 in 10 Jews are modifying that behavior. And then while 82% of American Jews believe that anti-Semitism has increased over the past 5 years, only 44% of the general public agrees. So even though 41% of Americans say they've witnessed at least one anti-Semitic incident over the past year, a larger percentage of the general population agrees that anti-Semitism has increased. And then I'd also like to say that the survey notes that almost 50% of the respondents believe that anti-Semitism is taken less seriously than other forms of hatred or bigotry. So whether that's hatred or bigotry against the LGBTQ+ community or racism, Jews are responding that they believe anti-Semitism is not being taken with as heavy as a regard. And then just to go over a couple of national numbers based on the Anti-Defamation League's audit on anti-Semitic incidents, which came out in April of 2021. So in the next few months, we'll be seeing an updated report. In 2020, there were 2,024 reported anti-Semitic incidents in the United States, which was a 4% national decrease from the year before. But it is still the 3rd highest year on record since 1979 when they started doing this survey, which was double of that in 2015. So most of those cases were made up of harassment incidents, which are anti-Semitic words, whether spoken or written, or actions taken by a person or a group. The next most popular form of incidents, for a lack of a better word, was vandalism. And then fortunately, the smallest number of incidents were assaults, which are targeted violent attacks. And then I'd also like to note that incidents in K through 12 schools and on college campuses decreased in the year of 2020, but that is very much likely because of the closure of schools due to the pandemic. And then Howard, I think you're taking it over here.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, so I mean, what does this mean for us locally? We're seeing historically high levels of numbers of anti-Semitic incidents, whether it's reported by ADL, whether it's reported by Maryland's incidents that are reported by the Maryland State Police in terms of things that are investigated criminally or what's investigated by the FBI. I think one of the, I'm going to carefully parse my words here, but the majority of incidents of hate crimes reported by the FBI that are religiously motivated target the Jewish community. Let me be clear, this doesn't mean the Jews are the biggest target of hate crimes in our country. That continues to be Black Americans. But when you look at hate crimes that are motivated by religion, it is motivated by anti-Jewish sentiment more than any other religious group, which is obviously very troubling. I mean, we are seeing it, we're hearing it, we all hear from our friends, and there are, it ranges. A lot of it is graffiti or property being defaced or things that we see. I mean, I get emails regularly, reports of, someone sees something written on a street sign or written on a building. And I'll say government is really good at cleaning this stuff up pretty quickly when they're made aware of it. So if you see something, as they say, if you see something, say something. report it to us, report it on our incident reporting page that we have on both the BJC and the associated websites, and we can get things cleaned up fast. But if we don't see it, if we don't know it, it doesn't get, admittedly, sometimes it sits there for a long time because no one speaks up. And so please, if you see something, we are, regularly in touch with the FBI when incidents happen. We make sure they're aware of it. We make sure that our county or state police are aware of it. On Monday, I got a call from our local FBI rep, just checking in, making sure we weren't hearing anything or that we were okay after what happened over the weekend, whether there's anything we needed. So that's really important. Emily, you want to move to the next slide? So let me talk about very tangibly, very specific, kind of a couple of anti-Semitic incidents our community experienced in the city over the summer. In June, there were a number of swastikas that were painted at various locations across Fells Point, light poles, the yellow salt box kind of thing. I mean, it was enough to attract media attention, and it was enough to attract what we thought was a really amazing community response of some residents decided, you know what, these graffiti, we're gonna turn around and we're gonna paint rainbow hearts over the graffiti to get rid of it quickly and to show that our community is about love and respect, as opposed to what's there. So it was it was lovely to see the community. At the end of the day, they did arrest someone who was responsible, who had mental health challenges. And sometimes these are about mental, unfortunately there is some anti-Semitism at the root, but when it's not about the community attacking us as much as it is mental illness manifesting anti-Semitism, and it's unfortunate. But we need to respond, and responding with examples of love is an important one. The next incident, if you want to move to the next one, Emily, was what happened in July at the German Hill Road Jewish cemeteries, where over the 4th of July weekend, 4th of July weekend, the caretaker, or it was just a couple people visiting, discovered swastikas painted on, I think, 15 gravestones. Horrifying. We documented it, of course. The paid caretaker for the cemetery came and scrubbed. It was scrubbed very quickly by a handful of people that weekend. It's terrifying to see in this day and age someone doing something like that. But what with the response, we brought together a diverse coalition of community leaders, and faith leaders, elected officials, and others. And at the end of that week, you could see Councilman Zeke Cohn, whose district it is in Southeast Baltimore, there at the microphone. The council, elected officials, the archdiocese, members of the Muslim community, Black church leaders, came out and spoke out collectively against hate, which is what we do as allies. And I'll get into kind of our community response on anti-Semitism, but I think the idea that we are going to work together as allies to combat hate is really important. If we don't stand up with other communities when they experience hate, how can we expect them to stand up with us? And it was really amazing to see them all come out. So let me take a step back and talk about kind of procedurally and community-wise how I think we all were feeling it in early 2019, feeling the surging anti-Semitism. I don't want to go too deep into, how much of it was driven by what was happening nationally with the former president and what he encouraged, but from Charlottesville to other incidents around the country to what we were seeing here, there was a surge of incidents. Pittsburgh, of course, and the extreme violence there, Poway, the New Jersey Hanukkah celebration that was marred, and the attacks we were seeing on the streets of New York of clearly observant Jews being attacked on the streets. It was troubling across the board, little stuff, big stuff, etc. So in spring of 2019, and some of you may have been there, we brought together leaders of Jewish institutions across Baltimore. We invited the top professional and the top lay leader from each institute, the synagogues, the organizations, to come to an afternoon gathering. I think we had it at Hisakamuno, and we asked them to. We brought in a handful of experts. We brought in Senator Cardin, the regional head of ADL, Mark Terrell. I think I even spoke. I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I talked about what we were doing locally, and then we intentionally created diverse tables. We had 75 or 80 people there, and we intentionally had people sit at tables that were diverse gender, diverse levels of religious observance, etc., and asked groups of those tables to talk about anti-Semitism in our community with focusing on 3 questions. What are we doing now that's working well in their minds? What are we doing now that's not working? And what different things should we be looking to do? The ideas, and then they reported back to the group, and the ideas that came from that group largely centered around 3 areas. They centered around education, they centered around advocacy, and they centered around allyship. So we said, okay, we're going to take those 3 areas and the various ideas that came of it, and we launched a community anti-Semitism task force led by Debs Weinberg, who at the time was the chair of the Associated Board, and Rabbi Andrew Bush from Baltimore Hebrew Congregation, who is currently the chair of the Baltimore Jewish Council. And we put together a task force of mostly lay leaders from across the community, people, some volunteers, some who we drafted, to spend time looking at this issue. There was so much interest from the Jewish community, communal professionals on this, that we actually created a kind of advisory panel of just professionals from the Jewish community who we could run ideas past, get their editing thoughts as well, because in a lot of ways, those Jewish communal organizations were going to be ones who were going to be asked with implementing some of the recommendations. So, but we didn't want a task force that was just dominated with Jewish communal professionals. We thought the lay leader community needed to be heavily involved. So after we spent a lot of time actually initially trying to define what is anti-Semitism to start. We needed to come up with a community definition that we'd be comfortable with, rooted out of the definition that Emily went through at the beginning. So there's like a 1.5-page document that talks about it, that we adopted. And from there, we adopted a report that focused on the 3 areas that I talked about that came out of the summit: education, advocacy, and allyship or relationship building. And then a 4th area that we thought was really important that emerged from our conversations with monitoring and responding. How do we track the incidents that we're doing? Because we need to know what's there. We need to know how we're responding to it, et cetera. And I see a couple of incidents have been raised in the chat, and I'll get to those as we keep going. Emily, you want to move to the, so what are we doing? What have we done? We released that report and the definition. Of course, we were set to have a second summit in person in spring of 2020, a year after the first summit. We all know what happened. Things got shut down. We ended up bringing the group together virtually again in the fall of 2020, and we released the report and the definition in November of 2020. So amid the pandemic, not quite the dramatic public release we wanted, but we thought it was important to move ahead. We couldn't wait for the end of the pandemic because, well, 22 months later, we're still here on Zoom. What's being done? So first thing we did, or one of the early things we did, was we created Emily's position, which is, so previously, and many of you probably know Jeanette Parmigiani, who was our director of Holocaust programming. Jeanette decided to retire in the winter of 2020, late, right around then. And she, her position had been part-time. Emily was a natural choice because she'd done a fair amount of work with Jeanette and Holocaust work, but we expanded the portfolio and made it a full-time position to include countering anti-Semitism programming. This position was created at the council. We thought, step one to show the importance in making sure we do it is number one is it can't all be me. But also we need to put our staffing where our priorities are. And forgive me if some of you heard me tell this story before, but like 7 years before I started as the executive director of the Baltimore Jewish Council, the council's leadership worked on priorities for the council's goals. And at the time, yes, fighting anti-Semitism was important, but it wasn't really classified as a top 5 issue just because we hadn't solved anti-Semitism, but there weren't a huge number of big incidents. So it kind of had diminished in terms of its urgency. That obviously changed. And so we reprioritized what we're thinking and expanded Emily's position. We also I have currently a joint associated BJC anti-Semitism committee of lay leaders that helps to implement the recommendations that came from the task force and makes and is a good sounding board. We are utilizing support from numerous community sources, including I think it's 100,000 from the Weinberg Foundation. I don't know how much it is from. We have dollars from the Weinberg Foundation and from others for anti-Semitism work, as well as just this past winter, a number of donor advised funds. The associated number of people sent us contributions to help with the work, realizing how important it is. Security continues to be a top priority. The director of security, Keith Tiedemann, who many of you may have heard make presentations or been involved with through your various organizations. Keith is on our staff. Keith does a phenomenal job of coordinating with local, state, and federal law enforcement. Saturday afternoon at 3:30, he was already, we were texting. He was already on a national a briefing call for Jewish security directors across the nation. He was hearing from our state and local law enforcement partners who were kind of checking to see was there any particular local threat we needed to be aware of. They weren't hearing anything, but it's reassuring to hear that. Keith was communicating that to leadership of Jewish institutions across the community. And Keith is already, I think, a handful of synagogues have already been in touch with him, just as, in the last couple of days, and are setting up active shooter training with the city police, with the county police, the Secure Communities Network, which is the National Jewish Security Organization in conjunction with JFNA. They're launching a new training program called, I think, Be Aware, that will put together a lot of the how do you respond to active shooter situations. I think it's going to be able to be offered either virtually or in person. We're getting a briefing on it early next week or middle next week, and then we'll try and coordinate with synagogues and other institutions that want to have that kind of training. We've kind of kept security. It's not only about anti-Semitism, obviously security, but a lot of what the most significant threats we worry about relate to it. So it's a big part of what we do and what we think about every day. And then of course we do a lot of community programs. Was this where I was handing it off to you, Emily? No, not yet. Okay. Anyway, we just in the last few months, within the last 9 months, we've done a variety of community programming, everything from, a Palestinian activist did a wonderful discussion debunking the idea that Israel's an apartheid state, and BDS, which gets at a lot of the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitism. We joined with a bunch of JCRCs and across the Mid-Atlantic and ADL for a pair of programs. One had progressive activists talking about how to root out anti-Semitism within the left. And then you had William Crystal, the noted conservative commentator, talking about how do you root out anti-Semitism within the right? The hardest, one of the things I think all of us see with talking about anti-Semitism is it's really easy to look at the other guy and talk about if you're a Democrat talk about the anti-Semitism among Republicans, but turn a blind eye to the anti-Semitism within your own side of the aisle. And we need to not do that. We need to call it anti-Semitism wherever we see it. We're seeing more and more domestic extremism. And so we're in confronting, and we're talking about how to confront white supremacy, how to confront extremism. And it's every conversation you hear things that are more terrifying than the next in terms of what's happening in kind of the depths of the internet, the depths of social media from some of these groups. Was this where I was handing to Emily, or one more? Okay, I'm sorry. We rehearsed this yesterday, and I obviously didn't get enough sleep last night. We also are working a lot with the college campuses and the Hillels. I think a lot of us worry about and hear stories about the anti-Semitism that our children or our grandchildren are experiencing and seeing on college campuses. We hear about them a lot. We had in the fall, we had a wonderful meeting with the people in charge of diversity offices across all the campuses, as well as the Hillel directors. And it was really interesting. In some cases, the Hillel directors and those diversity officers were old friends, and knew each other. In other cases, they were kind of being introduced for the first time at this meeting. We showed a short film that is one of the best I've seen on explaining anti-Semitism. It's like an 11-minute online video. And when I get a chat, when Emily's talking, I will copy the link to that, and I will put it in the chat for everyone who might want to go and watch it. It's terrific. And just very clear and very approachable. It was created by the Jewish Studies Center at Berkeley, and with Hillel and the Jewish Studies program there. And we had an honest conversation about follow-up. One of the most gratifying, because I think, and this gets back to the survey results Emily showed, I think there is a pretty persistent perception on campuses that anti-Semitism isn't treated as seriously as other forms of hate. And that gets to one of the questions we saw, which I'll touch on in a second. But I think there's a perception that the university diversity offices, and maybe even the diversity offices in public school systems and all as well, they see their jobs as being hired to protect communities of color, Black students, Latino students, the LGBTQ community, Muslim community. But they see the Jewish community as being part of something different, a privileged group, the white students. They don't sit, when there's an incident of anti-Semitism, some of them don't think it's part of their responsibility or their portfolio to deal with it, because that's not their mandate as the Office of Diversity. The Jews aren't really part of diversity. We are working hard to educate them that that is not true. And I think they've been receptive to that because they're seeing the statistics and they're seeing the violence, and we're going to continue to make progress, but that doesn't mean we're solving it. And there are parts of academia that have persistent anti-Semitism. We've all heard it. We've heard about academics who pursue pro-BDS resolutions with their national groups, things like that. I see there's a question about the incident involving the teaching assistant in Hopkins. That incident that happened in the winter of 2021, in which a professor, or not a professor, excuse me, a graduate teaching assistant at Johns Hopkins went on her social media and basically asked her followers, should she fail or give lower grades to her Zionist students. Terrible, terrible example of anti-Semitism. The university recognized that, but didn't necessarily respond as quickly or as thoroughly as we would have liked. And quite frankly, in my opinion, hid behind federal student privacy laws to not articulate how they responded. Now, I've heard through the grapevine, the students not teaching anymore, won't be allowed to teach anymore, etc. But like they made, strong public statements against anti-Semitism, but never clearly said what the punishment was for the student. I mean, I know through through people I've spoken to that there was discipline, there's a prohibition on the student teaching classes, etc. But there were a number of Jewish alumni and others who wanted the university to publicly say what they did and to not hide behind federal student privacy laws. And the university didn't, for a variety of reasons, which was frustrating. Subsequently, there have been some incidents at Hopkins, and Hopkins isn't alone here, where I will say that they learned lessons from what happened there. There was an incident in which someone on campus was shouting a bunch of anti-Semitic things at, I think, someone walking into the Hillel. Never caught who it was, but the university very quickly put out a very strong statement about protecting the Jewish community and oppose. I mean, they get it. And one of the things we've tried to offer to the universities and to others is, look, when an incident happens, we want to be helpful. We can tell you, we can help you shape your statement, shape your response in a way that will be reassuring to the Jewish community as opposed to not. I mean, I'll give you on another campus, there was an incident of anti-Semitic graffiti found in a very negative way. And the university put out a statement about it, but within that statement never once mentioned, if Jewish students feel unsafe in any way, please contact campus security, et cetera, et cetera. And the students who saw it were like, they're not treating it seriously. They're not treating it as a threat to us. And we try to help, avoid that with them. With that, I think I'm turning it over to Emily. Now I'm turning it over to Emily. I'm going to find the link to that video and I'm going to post it in the chat in just a second as Emily's talking.
Sure. So thank you, Howard. So I just want to talk about the BJC's Holocaust work before we end. Obviously, as I mentioned before, the Holocaust was not the start of anti-Semitism, nor was it the end of anti-Semitism, but it was a vast, terrible act of anti-Semitism. And the Holocaust and anti-Semitism go hand in hand, unfortunately. So the BJC has a Holocaust Remembrance Commission whose mandate is to educate and commemorate the Holocaust. So every year, the HRC, as I'll call them, plans our community-wide Yom HaShoah program and Kristallnacht program. And these are the Greater Baltimore community programs, very big. I will put a plug in for this year's. It will be premiering virtually as a pre-recorded program on May 1st. That is a Sunday. And so do mark your calendars for that. We'll actually be talking about the Wannsee Conference, which was where the final solution to the Jewish problem was created. And on that note, today actually marks the 80th anniversary of the Wannsee Conference. That was January 20th of 42. So it is the 80th anniversary today. We provide a Holocaust Survivor Speakers Bureau, which is made up of a wonderful group of first-generation survivors, but also second and even our first, third-generation survivor. And these speakers will go and share their testimony to student groups, to organizations. We have a request form online. And it's been a wonderful program. Even virtually, we have been able to send speakers to schools via Zoom or Google Classroom. It is a little challenging. Not all the survivors either have access to technology to do virtual testimony, or some of them don't feel comfortable sharing their stories over the internet, which is very understandable. But it's a wonderful free resource that we want to make sure schools and other community groups know we have. Testimony is the most important and effective form of Holocaust education. And unfortunately, we know that survivors are getting older, and we want to utilize this testimony as much as possible while we still can. And we're fortunate to have so many second and growing third generation survivors who are carrying on their family stories. The BJC works with the Jewish Museum of Maryland to provide professional development opportunities for teachers on the Holocaust. Twice a year, we hold a winter and a summer Teachers Institute for educators across the state to learn about a specific topic within the Holocaust. Our Winter Institute for 2022 is coming up at the beginning of March. Registration will be opening for that later this month, and the theme will be spiritual resistance during the Holocaust. So we're in the planning stages of that, but it's a really exciting program we've been doing for over 10 years. And we have a lot of teachers who find it really beneficial, and they come back year after year. And they also have the opportunity to earn professional development and continuing education credits by participating. So it's a really wonderful program. We also, the BJC does advocacy during the General Assembly to advocate for stronger Holocaust education in the state. And then we offer student learning opportunities as well. There's something that we do annually with the John Carroll School in Bel Air, which is a Catholic school. We host a program called Lessons of the Shoah, where we invite students and teachers from across the state to gather to learn again about the Holocaust and other genocides, to hear testimony, to let students engage with survivors and get that first person experience hearing those stories from their mouths. And we've been fortunate enough to do it virtually these past 2 years. It's not, of course, we would prefer to be in person, but it's important that students are still managing to get this education throughout these challenging school years, these past few years. And then we provide resource chunks for educators, which we haven't been doing as much during the pandemic, but we're always able to connect educators to resources around the Holocaust as well. And the last thing that I'll say is that we are creating a community networking group for third generation survivors. So those whose grandparents were survivors. And really what this networking group will be somewhere for these survivors to speak with each other, to discuss intergenerational trauma, to learn how to share their grandparents' stories, and then carry their stories on for the future. And so if any of you have children or grandchildren that you think might be interested in being involved in something like this, if your parents or if you yourself were a survivor, feel free to let them know to reach out to me. It's a really important group that, they are the next generation of survivors. And that is pretty much our presentation. So Howard and I are happy to take questions now.
I want to answer a couple of the questions that have come up, and I'll I see there's question that just came up related to the school system for working with Holocaust education. So a little background there. In the spring of 2019, so if anyone can remember back to before the pandemic, there was a bill in the General Assembly that we pushed pretty hard to try and get Holocaust education made more mandatory in the schools. We weren't really expecting it to go anywhere, honestly. It was a legislator who wanted to push it. The reality is in Maryland, our legislature is very hesitant to start weighing in on mandating specific curriculum of our public schools. They see it as something of a Pandora's box. Once you put in, we're going to mandate fiscal literacy or mandate Holocaust education as a topic, well, then the Armenians come in and say they want genocide, just picking a random example, or this group says there's not enough taught about this or that. And they just could see that they see themselves being inundated. So they're like, what gets taught content-wise in the schools is up to the professional educators. So they leave it for the state school board, the state superintendent, as well as then the local jurisdictions. So we went to the state superintendent at the time and said to her, hey, look at how little actually there is being taught, mandated in your curriculum framework on Holocaust education. And sometimes if you just respectfully go to the people in charge and point it out, they actually make improvements. And so she said, you know what, you're right. We're actually in the midst of doing a revamp of our social studies curriculum for elementary, middle, and high school. And we're going to do this, this, and this, including teaching the roots of anti-Semitism, related in middle school, so that when kids get to learning more about the Holocaust, they'll understand the underpinnings of it. And it made a lot of sense. Now, of course, this was promised in fall of 2019, and they're starting to make progress. And then the pandemic happens, and the schools were somewhat upended in terms of what they could concentrate on. Much of their work had to focus on how to teach kids over Zoom, as opposed to rewriting the social studies curriculum. They're getting there now. I know the Jewish Museum has been brought in to help them think through that curriculum. We're talking to some others about maybe helping to secure some outside funding to help with some of that curriculum development and implementation and training. I know the museum has also gotten a fair number of requests from school systems as the curriculum standards are being put out there for help to set up sessions of training for school systems, social studies leadership, whatever that is, whether it's at the county level or in individual high schools or middle schools. So they're engaged, and I think that's I think that's a good sign. I think it's really important. I think we've all seen those terrifying surveys that come out each year around. There's always around International Holocaust Remembrance Day and around Yom HaShoah. We always see these national surveys come up that says some amazingly low percentage of kids can identify what, or of adults or of high school graduates can identify what Auschwitz was, or has no idea of what how many even a rough number of how many Jews were killed or anything. I mean, just statistics that are terrifying as to how badly we're teaching history. And of course, I'm sure unfortunately, if we surveyed a lot of other areas of history, kids would do just as badly. But it's really personal for us when it comes to how little people know about the Holocaust. So I think strengthening this curriculum, strengthening what they have to look at is really important. I don't believe there is the federal law that's been advocated for. I don't believe it's passed. I don't think it's gotten anywhere. I know we've been working with JFNA and our partners across the country to try and push for it. I know that our delegation is generally supportive, but we've seen that. We're working on that. I see there's a question about is there more anti-Semitism than Islamophobia? I don't know the answer to that in terms of what there is more of. I know in terms of what the FBI statistics in terms of hate crimes, more incidents that they classify as hate crimes are driven by anti-Jewish bias than anti-Muslim bias. There's a question about what the FBI representative's unfortunate statement over the weekend, where he said it isn't an anti-Semitic act. His initial statement. I will say that I think we all cringed, those of us who heard that. I think all the federal folks cringed. I understood what he was trying to say. He was trying to say it wasn't driven. There wasn't some clear sense they had that Jewish institutions, synagogues, etc., across the country were under. There was some broader threat or some broader network of threat to Jewish synagogues that this guy was just the tip of the spear on. This guy was more or less a lone actor. I know there were a couple of arrests this morning in London related to things, and who knows what that'll present. There wasn't some broader threat. As soon as Sunday, there was a large call where the Homeland Security Secretary was on, and it represents the FBI and all. And I think Emily and I both listened for a while. Organized by National Jewish ADL and other, and they were very clear. They were not trying to say that this guy was not motivated. There weren't anti-Semitic roots in either what this guy did or what the woman who's in prison did. It was a poor choice of words. We've all seen it. We've all been there. So I wouldn't call the FBI agent anti-Semitic. I might call him a guy who was tired after 11-hour standoff, who said some things that weren't quite right. There was a question about why we didn't attend the Black colleges to attend. This was the first step. where we have existing relationships on the campuses with the Hillel directors. So one of the things we wanted to specifically do was, for this first meeting, was connect the Hillel directors to their diversity offices and focus there. Those campuses tend to have the largest Jewish populations. We wanted to specifically focus on making sure Jewish students on the campuses felt were going to be heard if they experienced incidents of anti-Semitism. On our agenda is to figure out how to reach the diversity offices of the campus, the many campuses in Maryland that don't have Hillels. And that could be the community colleges, that could be the historically Black colleges, that could be places that have pretty large Jewish populations that just don't have Hillels, like Stevenson, like McDaniel, like Frostburg. So there's definitely more work to be done. It's kind of, it's one, we can't do everything at once. So we're trying to make progress, learn lessons from the colleges, and then expand from there. I will say we have partnered on things with, for example, Morgan, a couple of years ago, and I don't know if any of you attended. We worked with Morgan. I think this was before your time, Emily. There was an amazing PBS film that looked at how survivors of the Holocaust, who had been like college professors and all, over in Europe and escaped and got to the United States, and the only institutions of higher education that would hire them for the most part were historically Black colleges, many of them in the South, and how there was this whole class of teachers who were survivors. Many of them was, thick accents from having been raised in Germany or elsewhere in Eastern Europe or Poland. And there's the amazing relationships they developed with their students, and how ultimately they, the relationships they formed and the impacts they made on teaching a whole generation of students at these historically Black colleges. And were, particularly many of them brought a lot of science to these campuses, and students who went on to medical school and all, and who credited the inspiration of the survivors who taught them science. And so, but anyway, we showed that at the theater there on Morgan, and had this amazing dialogue afterward. And it was a great opportunity to talk about the Holocaust and bring that to Morgan, and continue to look for ways to do that. There's a question about social media. Boy, yes. Emily, you want to start talking about social media? I mean, that is the, if you went on social media at all last spring during the Gaza conflict, boy, it was a cesspool.
Yeah, that is one of those, that's a Pandora's box in itself. You hear conflicting perspectives of that, where social media is a good place to challenge someone's opinions, but then you hear other things where it's better to not, because people are hiding behind their keyboards and they're going to say what they want to say because nobody can see them, so to speak. I will say that we are hoping to develop programming for high school students specifically, and college students, to educate them on where to find accurate information about anti-Semitism, about anti-Zionism, because frankly, there are a lot of impressionable young students who see influencers who are uneducated on issues posting infographics that include false information. And that age group is very susceptible to just wanting to post what their, so to speak, idol post, or thinking that if they see someone else posting something, it must be the cool thing or the right thing to post. So we are hoping to bring in Jewish activists and influencers in some capacity at some point this year to speak to these younger audiences and parents about anti-Semitism on social media, and especially anti-Semitism on college campuses as well. And they kind of go hand in hand, but just preparing these students for the anti-Semitism that they're going to encounter both on college campuses and online, on Instagram, on these social media sites where Jews are the minority. So
last
that is,
spring, yeah. I mean, Emily, do you want to stop sharing? We could see everyone. We could see everyone's faces again.
of course.
Terrific. Last spring we actually partnered on a program with the Associated Inside Israel Forum, as well as where it was like a 3-part series aimed at social media and high school students and all. I thought the content was good. I will admit it is hard to get the young people to engage, particularly because it was on Zoom. I appreciate all of you for sticking with us and being attentive and everything. I know our younger people, we're now back in person for the most part in school, but getting them on Zoom for stuff, particularly if it's not mandated for school, is really hard these days. And so the last spring's program, we had some decent attendance. I know the staff at Beth Tefillah was great at bringing on a number of students. Unfortunately, there were probably more people on those programs like us, and I mean age-wise. And I'm almost 50, so I consider myself way too old to be joining a bunch of high school students for social media. And it's we got to find a way to get them there and in touch. I know when I try and get my son to do the Zoom, he's looking at confirmation class Sunday morning on Zoom because they're taking a pause from being in person. And he's not thrilled to be on Zoom again. But the way of the pandemic, I guess. There's a question about activity of Ku Klux Klan in the greater Baltimore area. I've heard from when I've talked to some of our law enforcement partners, FBI, and the Maryland State Police. There's occasional stuff kind of more in the northeast, like Hartford, Cecil, where occasionally there'll be a bunch of flyers found or a little bit of recruiting or things like that. There doesn't seem to be substantial stuff going on right now. I mean, occasionally then we'll see news reports of like a bunch weirdly, like South Baltimore, like Federal Hill will occasionally get a bunch of flyers left on people's doors. But it's not there doesn't seem to be a huge presence or huge threat, I guess I would say, fortunately. But again, we're vigilant. I mean, as we know it's out there, but we also know a lot of it is with social media. People are able to have those private chat groups, whether it's on Facebook or whether it's on some other social media outlet that kind of escapes detection from law enforcement. More questions? I see Joanne's raising her hand. Feel free.
Yeah, just a comment. The bill that Linda Boteach was asking about passed the Congress. And what it provides are grant programs to public and private schools and nonprofits to apply for a grant. I'm not sure whether it's a matching grant, but a grant program, and I don't know what department it's in.
Yeah,
but
I'm sorry. There was a separate, the grant program passed. Yeah, there was a separate bill that we were much more enthusiastic about that was going to require Holocaust education across the schools that didn't go anywhere. But yes, that's right. I forgot about the grant program. Thank you for reminding me, Joanne. And I don't know what the state has done to take advantage of that. I know we actually had a call with Senator Cardin's office 2 weeks ago, talking a little bit about tapping into what sources of federal funding we might be able to tap into to help facilitate kind of the implementation and training related to Holocaust curriculum. And he was obviously very interested in that, given his history and his role.
Mm-hmm. I have a question.
I see Ms. Finkelstein.
I have a question. Do you have any recommendations for people of my generation, our generation, of actions, things that we can do in this fight against anti-Semitism?
Yes. So number one, don't let it go unchallenged. If you're assuming you feel safe or comfortable challenging, if you hear, it could be as simple as, if you're in line at the grocery clerk, and the grocery clerk makes some disparaging remark about the observant, that if there's an observant Jew who is ahead of you and they make some disparaging remark, challenge it. If you see something or hear a comment or you see graffiti, report it on, there's the website, the Associated and the BJC have a reporting website. Those incidents, we were partnering with ADL on it. Those incidents go to because ADL already had the back end computer thing. We didn't need to reinvent the wheel. But when they get incidents reported to them from the Baltimore area, they get sent to us as well. And collectively, we talk about how to respond. It can be submitted anonymously. It could just be, hey, I saw this terrible graffiti written on Smith Avenue, and letting us know, and we can work to get it cleaned up, whether it's in the city or the county. We can, and you don't even have to put your name on these things. But if you want follow up, if you experience something, I'll, and then I think, because and I would report it. There are times I know where, like a swastika has been painted in a neighborhood. Swastikas have been painted on the home of someone who's Jewish, or put with the shaving cream or chalk, and neighbors seeing this have said, we can't let this stand. I don't want my Jewish neighbors to see that someone did this to their house, and they've cleaned it off and washed it off before they saw and not reported it, which is both a wonderful expression of love, but also we want to take pictures. We want to be able to report it. We want to know what happened. We want police to be able to investigate. So take a picture, report it to us. But, and if you're comfortable, if you're not comfortable challenging, if you think it's going to threaten your safety, if you think the person might be, then report it later. Don't put yourself into harm's way. And then the other thing I would say is, stand with others against hate. As I think I said toward the beginning, like when we see, it goes back to the old, when if we don't stand with others, how can we expect them to stand with us? And so it's joining in, and it's also finding that, anti-Muslim comments that you might hear among people, or anti-Black comments, or anti-LGBTQ comments or actions, those aren't acceptable either. And you need to be willing to speak up in both everyday conversation and things too, or if there's an incident, to speak up. And if there's bills that are out there, and we try and communicate about them, that are tougher enforcement of hate crimes or whatever, join in advocacy. Write to your local officials or your state officials or your federal officials in support of it. Those would be the key things, and educate your children and grandchildren about anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust. Make sure that they are engaged and know.
Thank you.
Mrs. Mondell looks like she is. You're muted. I think you're still muted. There you go.
It just brings back, this was wonderful today, I have to tell you, but it's also a little scary. I just remembered when I was younger, and my grandparents had a store in a neighborhood that was not Jewish at all. And I used to spend a lot of time there. And I had two really, really good friends. And we were best friends, but we would have a fight and she would call me a dirty Jew. And I just remember that. It's so funny how it brings back all these memories that, over the years that have just stored up. So, anti-Semitism isn't new. I also remember the South Pacific song, "You've Got to Be Carefully Taught." And it was all about, anti-Semitism and being Jewish. And so, it's just, I think it's a very scary thing that it's still here. And I think it's growing by leaps and bounds, it seems to me. They're just people who feel that way. And I don't think that it's so easy to change their minds. I really don't. That's just my feeling.
I think getting to kids at a very early age is really important. I think,
yes.
I think that early education, against hate. I mean, ADL has some wonderful in-school programs, which I know a number of our public school systems and private schools have adopted or adapted. It's really important. I see someone referring to in 1969 going to college and being asked to see their horns. I remember my mother
Oh.
tells me stories of when she started
Right.
college at the University of Illinois Chicago, and people. I mean, first of all, of course, there were quotas
Right.
back then. There's a terrible history that
It is.
doesn't get taught very well, and
Oh.
and there's also we've normalized hate way too much in this country. We've normalized in our political discourse that that it's okay to attack Jewish journalists on Twitter because
Right.
they're Jewish, because they're writing something, and attack their Jewish faith because they're writing something unpleasant about our candidate of choice. And all of that, we need to all collectively say it's not acceptable. And admittedly, we are a very small percentage of this country.
It's true.
But this country is built on the strength of protecting all of our different minority groups. And that's very important. Now, admittedly, I can't see all the screens. So if there's other people raising their hand on the screen that's not up for here, please unmute yourself and jump in. And feel free to ask.
I'll jump
Great.
in for a minute. It's Marsha Rosenblatt.
Hi, Marcy.
One of the things that I have tried to do with my children and grandchildren and all their friends and things is that my parents were survivors of the pogroms.
Hmm.
Parents' family went out the back door where the Russians, they were coming to get them because
Sure, three of my
in the
grandparents'
shtetl.
families
Right.
that way
and
too.
I think that we need to talk to our families. We need to talk to their friends. So people realize that all this has been going on and stuff. And because I sometimes can be a little sarcastic, her story about the Jews and the horns is many years ago in one of the grocery stores in Randallstown. And I went in and they had, it was Yontif and for the New Year. So he had ham and black-eyed peas and all this stuff. And I said to him, no, you don't do this for New Year and all. And he said to me, oh, I had no idea you were Jewish. And I said to him, yes, when we take our horns off, we look just like everybody else. And after that, when the holidays came up, I went and told him what to do. He started putting up Hanukkah decorations as well as Christmas and stuff and all, but I had no idea.
Look, one of the things we can do is, if we live in a neighborhood that's not exclusively Jewish, invite friends and neighbors, invite coworkers to, I regret this was one of the big spring of 2020 initiatives that we had just launched when the pandemic happened was a national effort related to seders, and we were going to invite a stranger to Seder, invite a coworker who'd never been to a Seder, invite a neighbor. I'm drawing a blank on what the name of the initiative was, but it was launched by the sister-in-law of someone who had been killed in Pittsburgh, and she lived in Montgomery County, and she launched this effort, and we were all set in the to make it a big deal in the spring of 2020, and unfortunately, all of us had Seders by ourselves in the spring of 2020. We were a month into the pandemic, and we basically had to cancel communal family Passover. It was we had a lovely Zoom Seder with my mother-in-law and my mother. But like that was a profound, and it's an opportunity I want us to resume again and to, invite people, when I've gone and joined, the Muslim break the fast dinner during Ramadan too. I mean, learning about each other's traditions and experiencing them, particularly family to family, child to child makes such a difference. Building, you know, we've tried, it's a little tangential, but kind of relevant to this. You know, when I came into our interfaith, when I came into BJC, a lot of our interfaith work involved doing things like we'd put a rabbi, an imam, and a priest up in front of a room, and they would talk about the similarities across our our religious doctrine and all. And we said that's useful and it's informative and all, but what could be more useful to building deeper relationships is let's have representatives of synagogues, mosques, and churches come together and do community service together and have dinner together. We've done, for the last few years, we've joined together at a church, or this year we did it outside at the JCC parking lot, but we also have done it at a mosque where we come together and we bring supplies in to pack bags for people temporarily experiencing homelessness. And we talk about, we have a kosher dinner together, families sitting mixed at tables from the different religions, and the kids get to know each other a little bit, and we pack the bags together, and we talk about homelessness and how our different faiths think about how we should help do it. And those build deeper relationships that are lasting and make a difference for our kids, because I know I'm not going to solve hate, but maybe my kids will grow up in a world that's got less hate in it.
Yeah. Well, for a few years prior to the pandemic, UMBC had an annual Freedom Seder where they invited students and faculty from all different parts of the world who were working at UMBC. And we did a communal discussion of oppression related back to Exodus and so on and so on. It was really very beautiful.
And Freeman would often show up. Jeremy invited me one year. Jeremy, the Hillel director, invited me to join one year. It's a lovely experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would like to ask people, we'll take one more comment or question, and then we have a few closing remarks. So I think Joanne Orlinsky had a question. Thank you.
It's again a comment rather than a question. Howard, talk for a minute about ECPY.
ECYP.
Well, I learned it wrong the first. ECPY.
Yes, of course.
Right.
So I'll briefly talk. Well, it's the Elijah Cummings Youth Program, which began over 20 years ago as an initiative with Congressman Cummings and African American and Jewish leaders in our community. It is a 2-year fellowship for high school students who attend school within the 7th Congressional District, mostly students of color. They are selected in a pretty rigorous process. We don't just take the top students. We're looking for students who we think will benefit and make a difference from this program. So some are great academically and some are working really hard and challenged. They spend their junior year, they're selected toward the end of their sophomore year. They spend their junior year community service, leadership, and learning about Israel. We send them to Israel for 3.5 weeks between their junior and senior year, where they live at Yemen Ord, which is an amazing place that has a very large population of Ethiopian Jews and others. And they explore Israel, they learn, they spend a weekend in homes in Ashkelon over Shabbat to learn about Shabbat and our sister city. And then they come back, and in their senior year, they talk about their experience. They continue to do leadership. They do community service. And in the last couple of years, we've added this amazing new component where we have the social justice teen fellowship, where these seniors in the Elijah Cummings program pair with students from the Jewish community, high school students, juniors and seniors in the Jewish community. And they spend a year together exploring our mutual shared histories in Baltimore. The first year or two, we did a teen summit as to how to get active on social justice. The last couple of years, we've pivoted and partnered with a producer at WYPR and the students that produce podcasts and interviews exploring Jewish and Black issues. The kids become ambassadors, I guess I'd say, to our world of hope and everything. It's continued since Elijah's death. Congressman Mfume has come on to be the honorary chairman. Congressman Cummings' daughter Jennifer has joined the board, and it's an amazing opportunity to build Jewish-Black relations, which is really important. And with that, I know we're getting the hook. So we are going to say thank you all very, very much for the opportunity to speak to you. Emily and I have really enjoyed it.